In this short video, you will learn more about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Before starting on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, let's take a few minutes to review the idea of the price level. A price level is a way to measure how high or how low prices are in an economy. You may also remember that the price level of an economy can be measured using a GDP deflator or a price index such as the Consumer Price Index or the Producer Price Index. Also remember, high price levels or price levels greater than 1 mean that consumers are able to purchase a smaller amount of goods and services with a given amount of money. Lower price levels, especially less than 1, mean that individuals are able to produce more goods and services with a given amount of money. Let's take a minute also to review the two time frames economists talk about. The two time frames in economics are the long run and the short run. The short run is a time period in which prices don't change very much. Sometimes economists refer to that fact that prices don't change very much as the prices being sticky. Prices may be sticky due to contracts, especially labor contracts, but could all include other things because the supplier has agreed to sell a product at a fixed price for a given amount of time. It also takes time for higher input prices to transfer to the final goods. The long term is the time period where prices do change. Before seeing how aggregate demand curves are created, let's take a moment to review how economists create aggregate demand graphs. First, the horizontal axis, or the back and forth axis, measures the amount of GDP and is often labeled with the letter Y for income. The letter Y is selected because the letter I, as you may recall, is used to indicate investment. You may also recall that as we move from left to right, the numbers get bigger. Thus, as one moves from left to right, the GDP increases. The vertical axis, the axis that runs up and down, is the price level and may be abbreviated with the letter P for price level. As you may also recall that as we move from top to bottom, the numbers get bigger. Thus, as one moves upward from the bottom of the line, the price level increases. There are two reasons for a downward sloping demand curve. First, there is a wealth effect which impacts purchasing power. If a person is on a fixed income, increases in prices will cause the person to demand fewer goods, and decreases in the price level will cause the individual to purchase a greater amount of goods. Interest rate effect increases with the price level mean that the prices of all goods and services are increasing. Interest charged on a loan is just another price. It is the price of money. Thus, as interest rates increase along with other prices, less consumption of goods will be bought with loans, and lower the interest rate, the more goods and services will be purchased on credit. Let's take a minute to look at how the price level and the wealth effect interact with one another. Before seeing the relationship between price levels and income, let's take a minute to review how an economist likes to create aggregate demand graphs. First, the horizontal axis that runs back and forth measures the amount of GDP and is often labeled with the letter Y. The letter Y is selected because the letter I, as you may recall, is used to indicate investment in the GDP formula from the previous video. You may also recall that as we move from left to right, the numbers get bigger. Thus, as one moves from left to right, GDP increases. The vertical axis, or the axis that runs up and down the slide, is the price level and may be abbreviated with the letter P for price level. You may also remember that the price level increases as we move up the line. Let's take a look at the impact of the price level on wealth. An individual has an income of $40,000. If the price level is 1, he or she can consume $40,000 worth of goods and services. Let's put a little dot there. If the price level increases to 2, then the individual earning $40,000 is only able to consume $20,000 worth of goods and services. Put a little dot there as well. If the price level decreases to 0.5, that is, all the prices in the economy are cut in half, then the individual earning $40,000 is able to consume $80,000 worth of goods and services. Let's put a little dot there as well. If all 3 points are connected, then we have an aggregate demand curve. Once again, it is important to notice that when the price level increases, the GDP that individuals are able to consume declines, and when the price level declines, the GDP that individuals can consume goes up. Let us look at the interest rate and its impact on GDP. Since the interest rate is the price for borrowing money, it has an impact on GDP. Let us assume that the current price level is P2 and individuals consume at Y2. If the price level increases from P2 to P1, then the interest rates will also have increased because the interest rate is just the price of money. At the higher interest rate, individuals will borrow less to purchase expensive goods, and businesses are less likely to borrow to finance expenditures on capital goods. In either case, GDP will decline from Y2 to Y1. By the same token, if the price level decreases from P1 to P3, the interest rates will also decrease. At lower interest rates, individuals will borrow more to purchase expensive goods, and businesses are more likely to borrow to finance expenditures on capital goods. In either case, GDP will increase from Y2 to Y1. Increases in the price level will also cause domestically produced goods to become more expensive, and decreases in the price level will cause domestically produced goods to become cheaper. There are 4 things that cause aggregate demand curves to shift. They are consumption, government spending, investment, and net exports. Consumption Increases in consumption mean that incomes have increases. Increases in income will cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. Increases in wealth will also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. This is assuming that the price level remains constant. Expectations about things that we consume will also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Increases in the number of individuals in the economy will also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Increases in personal taxes will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. Government spending increases will cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. Increases in government spending mean an increase in income because what the government spends money on becomes income for other individuals. Increases in investment will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. However, if there are increases in interest rate, this will cause investment to decrease and cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. Increases in the cost of capital goods will also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. Net exports cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right or to the left depending on whether exports are increasing or imports are increasing. Specifically, an increase in exports will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right, and increases in imports will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. Let's take a minute to look at the impact of the shift to the right of an aggregate demand curve and to the shift to the left of an aggregate demand curve on price level and GDP. Let's see what happens when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. Here we have our standard aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve with an equilibrium point of E0 and a price level of P0 and an income of Y0. Now suppose the government spends some additional money on rebuilding the highway infrastructure. An increase in government spending causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right because the government will demand more goods and services. If we draw, this will create a new equilibrium point E1. If a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point to the price level axis, we see that the price level increases from P0 to P1. If a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point to the GDP axis, a new equilibrium GDP is found. Notice that the price level has increased from Y0 to Y1. Let's look and see what happens when the government cuts back on spending. First, we'll start out with a standard aggregate supply and demand curve. The two cross each other at E0. The price level associated with E0 is P0, and the equilibrium GDP is Y0. Now suppose the government cuts back on spending for education and health services. A decrease in government spending will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left because the government will demand fewer goods and services. This gives us a new equilibrium point, E1. If a line is drawn from E1 to the price axis, a new equilibrium price level is found. Notice that the price level decreases from P0 to P1. If a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point to the GDP axis, a new equilibrium GDP is found. Notice that the price level decreases from Y0 to Y1. There are two important variables that cause the aggregate supply curve to shift. First, increases in resources or inputs like oil, food, metals, and wages will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. Indeed, the lecture on inflation, we saw that increases in strategic resources like oil, food, metals, and wages would cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, causing cost push inflation. Second, new technology, the increased use of technology or the adoption of new technology to new industries will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. Let's take a look at the impact on the equilibrium price level and GDP as a result of a shift in the supply curve. Let's look and see what happens when the supply curve shifts to the left. For example, if there's a drought in the Midwest region of the United States. Since the Midwest part of the U.S. produces much of the wheat, barley, oats, corn, and soybeans, which are used in a variety of food products, there will be an increase in the amount of these staple food products available. As a result of the decrease of these foods, the supply curve will shift to the left. If a line giving us a new equilibrium point at E1, if a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point to the price level axis, a new equilibrium price level is found. Notice that the price level has increased from P0 to P1. If a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point to the GDP axis, a new equilibrium GDP is found. Notice that the new equilibrium GDP has decreased from Y0 to Y1. Let's look and see what happens when the supply curve shifts to the right. For example, if there's a good growing season in the Midwest region of the United States. Since the Midwest part of the U.S. produces much of the wheat, barley, oats, corn, and soybeans, which are used in a variety of foods, there will be an increase in these staple foods. As a result of the increase in these foods, the supply of food will shift to the right, creating a new equilibrium point E1. If a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point E1 to the price level axis, a new equilibrium price level is found. Notice that the price level has decreased from P0 to P1. If we draw a line from the new equilibrium point E1 to the GDP axis, a new equilibrium GDP is found. Notice that the new equilibrium GDP Y1 is much bigger than Y0. In the lecture on inflation, you learned that aggregate supply curve was represented as a vertical line. In this short presentation, you will learn how the vertical aggregate supply curve comes into existence. To see how a long-run aggregate supply curve is created, we need to start with a standard aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. The place where the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve cross each other creates an equilibrium point, which is unnamed in our graph. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the price axis, the equilibrium price level is found, called P0 in our graph. If a line is drawn down from the equilibrium point to the GDP axis or the output axis, the equilibrium gross domestic product is found for the economy. In this case, this is Y0. Now suppose that the government spends some additional money to repair the highway system in the United States. Remember that an increase in government spending causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. The shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve causes all prices, including the prices of inputs like wages, oil, and food, to increase as a result of higher incomes. So there will be an increase of the price level from P0 to P1 and an increase of GDP from Y0 to Y1. As you may remember, when there's an increase in prices for things like oil, wages, and food, this will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. When the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, the price level will go up to P2 and the equilibrium GDP will drop down to Y0 again. The government sees this decline in GDP from Y1 to Y0 not as a normal return to a previous level of GDP before the increase in government spending, but as a recession. The government, thinking that there is a recession, will spend more money, perhaps on education. The increased spending on education will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. The price level will increase from P2 to P3, and the GDP will increase from Y0 to Y2. Once again, the price level increases as a result of the shift of the aggregate demand curve. The increasing price level will cause the prices of inputs like wages, oil, food to increase as a result of higher incomes. The increased input prices will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, causing the price level to shift up to the GDP to drop from Y2 back to Y0, and the price level to go up to P4. Notice that GDP will decline once again from Y2 to Y0. If a line is drawn through all the equilibrium points at Y0, the aggregate long-run aggregate supply curve will be created, which is a vertical line. In the long run, aggregate supply is seen to be fixed at a given level of Y.